Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today to discuss the future of 1031 exchanges. I'm Damon Elder, publisher of the DIWire.com, the nation's leading news source for the largely illiquid alternative investment industry. I'm joined today by a panel of true experts on this issue. First, we've got Keith Lampe in the bottom there. He is the president of Inland Private Capital Corporation, which is the single largest syndicator of securitized 1031 exchange programs in the nation. He is also joined by a fellow sponsor, Louis Rogers, who is the founder and CEO of Capital Square, another one of the top tier sponsors of 1031 exchanges. And Louis personally is considered one of the godfathers of the industry, which we'll get into in a little bit. Tony Tresso also joins us. He is the president and chief executive officer of the Institute for Portfolio Alternatives, also known as the IPA, of course. And of course, John Harrison rounds out our panel. He is the executive director of ADISA, which is the Alternative and Direct Investment Securities Association. Both ADISA and the IPA are trade groups that represent many of the most active participants in the securitized 1031 exchange community, and they are significant members of the broader coalition that educates and advocates on behalf of Section 1031. Now, we've had a tremendous turnout for this webinar with more than 700 registrants, so it's clearly a topic of great interest. I'd like to thank the audience for the questions that have been submitted during the registration process, and I trust most of them will be addressed during our discussion today. If you'd like, you can still submit a specific question directly to me at Damon, D-A-M-O-N, at thediwire.com, and we'll try to work any pertinent questions into the discussion as we go. So with that, why don't we get started? I assume most of our audience are very familiar with 1031 exchanges, but I think we'd be remiss if we didn't start our discussion with a background on Internal Revenue Code Section 1031. Louis, again, in addition to being a very successful sponsor of 1031 exchanges, you've been credited with being one of the founders of the industry, as you were one of the original syndicators of securitized 1031 exchanges back in the 90s when you were a partner at the law firm of Hirschler and Fleischer. So I think this would be a perfect question to begin our discussion with you. So when and why was 1031 added to the tax code, and what do 1031 exchanges allow their user to do?
Thank you, Damon. Thank you, fellow speakers. I don't know when I became the old guy, but I don't like it. I'm going to be the young guy today. Young guy who's talking about Section 1031 of the Internal Revenue Code that was adopted in 1921. It's been with us largely unchanged for all those years. And it's a golden oldie. It's real simple, as they say down south. You can read it in plain English, and it hasn't changed very much. It basically allows the deferral of gain on sale or exchange of business or investment property. Now, people get confused. We're not talking about your principal residence. There's a provision for that. We're talking about deferring the gain on investment or business property. Been in the Internal Revenue Code since 1921, was amended in 1923 to eliminate stocks and bonds and things that we don't know what they mean. What's a shows in action? I don't know what a trust certificate is, but those things were eliminated in 1923, and we've gone happily ever after since. The theory behind 1031 is not entirely clear. Back in 21, there wasn't much of a legislative history, but we think the primary theory is continuity of investment. A taxpayer started with real estate, like-kind property, and they ended with real estate, like-kind property. And our theory of taxation is based on actually having cash, something that you could quantify, not property. And so, the theory was unrealized gains were not taxed. There'd have to be some realization event. When you swap property for property, farmer A meets farmer B at the creek, and they swap property, tax should not be imposed. That's the primary reason, continuity of investment. And we're talking about theoretical gains because they haven't been realized. There's also a second plausible rationale, which is just the administrative inconvenience of taxing all these literally horse trades in 1921. What did you trade? Probably traded horses and buggies. And how would you tax all those things back in the old days before computers? So that's the gist of it. The theory has taken hold. It's survived all these years. and survived the '86 Tax Act. It almost didn't survive the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of '17. And there's more than a little bit of irony here that it was basically the Republicans who eliminated personal property from Section 1031. Now we're talking about what could happen if there's a change in Congress and in the White House, but in '17, personal property was eliminated by the Republicans, and it was Kevin Brady, Ways and Means, that wanted to eliminate 1031 entirely. So there's a little bit of irony there as we talk about what a new administration could do to us.
So just to clarify real quick, and maybe Keith, you can jump in here. Originally, back when 1031 was added to the tax code nearly 100 years ago, wasn't it primarily geared towards farmers and people who had large agricultural holdings and perhaps not large holdings of cash?
Yeah, to Lewis's point, and obviously there was a good good historical overview. I think the genesis, the theory is it started there, but over the course of time, and as Lewis pointed out, this is a provision in the tax code that's about to celebrate its hopefully 100-year anniversary being a provision in the tax code. It obviously evolved, and as real estate investment activity became more prolific, it became a key component toward any and all type of investment property. So we've seen that evolve tremendously over the years, and the provision like kind is somewhat fluid as long as it's investment property for investment property. And an investor that's selling raw undeveloped land can reinvest his or her proceeds into a commercial asset, a multifamily asset. Oftentimes we interact with investors that are selling a rental property, a 3-flat in downtown Chicago, where I'm situated currently, and that investor might roll his or her proceeds into a self-storage facility or a medical office building. So like kind has been fairly fluid, and as I said, it's evolved from being the swap of raw undeveloped farmland to other types of income-producing investment properties.
And you've all touched on investment properties. Does it also apply to single-family homes that are not your primary residence?
Yes, rental properties.
Yep. Okay. So they don't have to be duplexes or apartments. Single-family homes qualify.
Right. Basically, any sort of real estate is like kind to any other sort of real estate. And part of what makes 1031 so interesting is the IRS and Treasury have supported us with an enormous body of private letter rulings, revenue procedures, if you remember that one. Without this enormous body of law, we wouldn't have such a broad frontier on which to exchange. Like kind could have meant exactly like kind. It could have meant a rental house for a rental house, but what it means today is that an investment property for an investment property. We've had great support from the administration and very broad, strict, but broad rules.
I'd like to add one
go ahead,
thing,
John.
if I might, Damon, on Lewis. I think we probably go back before Kevin Brady. Maybe Dave Camp actually was the first Republican who started eyeing 1031s, and the real reason is because they're looking for pay for. They have some program or some, expenditure they want to pay for, and they think, okay, maybe let's look for some loopholes we can close. And that's why Dave Camp locked himself in a room for a couple of weeks and started looking at every little thing. I think Dave's back at Price Waterhouse by now, but he started looking at everything. And that's when the current movement, which is really bipartisan in terms of examining everything, started. So I know we'll get to that later, but I think it even precedes Brady's look in 17 or earlier. So
I'm told that Ronald Reagan even took a look in '86 to try to flatten the tax code.
that's right.
John, you touched on a landmine there, the word loophole. So I want to kind of discuss a little bit 1031's as loophole. Chuck Marr, who is the senior director of federal tax policy at a Washington think tank, the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, has said that, quote unquote, or quote, 1031 exchanges are a major loophole that just make no sense, and that the Biden proposal is way past its due date. How appropriate is this term loophole in regards to 1031 exchanges? I'll open that to Keith. You looked like you were ready to say something.
Yeah, well, I think that's an important part of our collective messaging, and I think a big undertaking that the coalition has leaned into. From an industry participant standpoint, we take issue with the characterization that this falls into other types of tax loopholes. The key distinguishing feature here that everybody we need to convey is that this isn't tax forgiveness. This is tax deferral. In fact, there were several academic impact studies. The Linan Petrova study is probably going to be cited several times throughout this dialogue. And the key statement the key outcome in that particular study was that, in effect, eventually 88% of tax deferred exchanges eventually end in the payment of taxes. So again, when an investor completes a 1031 exchange, they sell a rental property, they reinvest into another investment property, that tax is deferred, not forgiven. And oftentimes, eventually, there is a settling up of sorts in the way of taxation. And I think that's oftentimes overlooked and sometimes mischaracterized with regard to some of the political rhetoric when looking at Section 1031 as a potential pay for, if you will.
Keith, we got a question here. I don't know that our viewers can see it, but we got a question from one of our viewers. Could you cite that statistic from the Linan Petrova study yet again? And we'll talk more about that study as we go.
Yeah, it was 88% of tax deferred exchanges eventually end in a taxable event. So,
They only go one
oftentimes
generation. Yeah, that means so 88%. Oh, it only goes one cycle. Theoretically, you could defer and defer and defer past, but that's not what happens.
Right. So
it points out 88% of the time it's a final tax maneuver.
So there's often, Lewis and I have been on panels, and when we're kind of marketing the power of Section 1031 exchanges to investors, we'll use the term swap till you drop. And there's a theory that over a series of transactions, a buyer and a seller come together and deferral is achieved. If you continue that path and you effectively take your real estate to the grave, there's a step up in cost basis. The theory behind swap till you drop is a very powerful tax planning tool, but in reality, in effect, it's not necessarily been the case in terms of how transactions have actually settled up. And I think that's what the Linan Petrova study did a great job of actually applying some data and numbers to kind of making that point.
So let's talk just briefly about that. I want to bring Lewis back in because, again, I think it's a highly technical legal aspect. The deferral, the swap till you drop, the step up in basis. So when an investor who has exchanged one or multiple times passes away, their property then passes to their heirs, and there's a step up, quote unquote, in the tax basis to
The fair market.
Exactly, to the fair market, which means they have essentially, in fact, have avoided the payment of the capital gains tax of all those cumulative tax or exchanges. So, I mean, isn't that essentially, and maybe it accounts for the 12%, isn't that tax avoidance? Isn't that a loophole to allow you to avoid capital gains tax, Lewis?
Avoidance and loopholes are pejorative. Those are negative words. The step up in basis is intended. That's how the tax code was written. That's how it works. 1031 is an exception to the general rule of taxation, but it's very much a rule, and exceptions are strictly interpreted. That's why 1031 rules are so strict. The days are strict, like kind is strict, the rules are strict, but we're talking about congressional intent, congressional policy. I would say a loophole is getting a result that was not intended, something not within the spirit and the intent of a section of the Internal Revenue Code. Deferral is exactly what's intended under 1031. The step up is what is intended in the estate tax. Those are things within the spirit and intent of Congress, not a loophole, not something bad, not tax avoidance, good tax planning.
Which goes back to something.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead, John. I'm turning to you.
If a farmer had investment property in 50 years ago, there was $10,000 when he bought it, and now it's worth $5 million. That's really not what the tax intended as well. He would have an asset on his hands that could never be used or sold, and it would just continue to run down and be held. I mean, that's a holding period that happens. That's one of the reasons, the economic velocity of keeping the real estate moving, of improving the real estate, of growing the wealth. It's not an idea that you just sit on it and try to avoid taxes by not ever selling it.
And how does sorry, Louis, how does,
go ahead.
I was just going to add, how does depreciation, which is, another tax advantage of real estate ownership, how does that tie in, if at all, to 1031 and the value of this process?
It cuts both ways. There's a price to be paid for 1031. You have much reduced depreciation deductions, greater capital gain taxes, and greater recapture. It's not a free lunch getting this deferral. Depreciation is simply the allowance for wear and tear because real estate wears out over time. Been in the code since I can't remember when, forever.
Gotcha. So I want to bring Tony into the discussion here a little bit. I think clearly you all seem to agree that loophole, avoidance, those are not an accurate description for 1031, are not fair.
Exception.
They're exactly exceptions. But Tony, we've already brought up, and I know we'll talk more about it, the Linan Petrova study. Could you kind of give us a little background on that? Because I know the IPA as well as the DSA have been participants in the promulgation and the development of this academic study, which again, we'll talk to a bit more. Who are Linan Petrova? What is the study that folks are starting to refer to?
So Linan Petrova are two leading professors with a focus on real estate. They had been involved in the original study that was commissioned by the 1031 Coalition, led by the Real Estate Roundtable. There's John, you may know the exact number, but there's greater than a dozen real estate associations that were involved with commissioning that initial report. We recently had it updated this year. It was just finalized mid-year, and that report sort of built off of the original study, but also took it a little bit further by actually diving deeper into specific exchange data that wasn't once available to us. And so they were able to get into some additional information, additional data sources, either through IPX 1031 Exchange, through Marcus Millichap and other sources to really be able to sort of break down the information in more meaningful layers to represent the sort of the true essence of what the impact of 1031 is and how it's being used.
And real quick, we did have a follow-up question, which I think is cogent to the discussion.
There's a, I mean, just put in a quick plug for Tony. Tony, I believe you have a webinar from Linan Petrova on your website, right? That people could view if they wanted to see the presentation. And we have a copy of their original paper on our website. So either IPA.com or DSA.org. I hate to be, but in order to cite it, if you wanted to actually read the studies or see the presentation on it, you could go to either one of those two.
You can get all the details. Yeah.
Well, real quick before we move on, this 88% regarding the payment of taxes during an exchange. One of our viewers asked for a clarifying question. They'd like to know, so when you're referring to that 88% of 1031 exchangers, it's the heirs that are selling the properties when they die. I don't think that's what that statistic refers to. Louis, you're shaking your head.
88% of exchanges result in a taxable transaction. And
does that mean one exchange, or is that along the way? Because again, you can do multiple exchanges.
I think it's along the way. 88% of the gain ultimately gets recognized and taxable. Okay. So that's a fairly short time. Does anyone remember? Is it 3, 5 years, 10 years?
I don't remember, Louis.
Pretty short. Something.
Yeah, the average length of time is a little over 3 years, I believe, something like that.
It's pretty short, surprisingly.
All right, don't make me mute any microphones. This is turning into a presidential debate. Keith, I know you had something you wanted to add. Why don't you go ahead?
Just to put a kind of a period at the end of the 88% stats. So the 12% that do ultimately achieve tax forgiveness, those are situations where an investor continued along their exchange path, and then the liquidation was completed by the heirs, and then they received or achieved that step up in cost basis. But I think it's that data point. There's another one that's in the Linan Petrova study, which suggests that out of every 1/3 of transactions, a portion of the exchange is paid in taxes. So there's a portion of Moot that is ultimately achieved, which results in the payment of taxes. And I think what a lot of this was meant to characterize is that, when we think about, using terms like loophole, when we think about the scoring that lawmakers may apply to Section 1031, and they look at all the transaction volume and they say, well, if we taxed all of that, here's the dollar amount that we would have for other purposes. It's important to kind of take a step back and appreciate and analyze the actual interaction and human behavior behind how investors, how taxpayers are ultimately interacting with this section of the tax code. So those were real life data points, as Tony mentioned earlier. We didn't have access to a lot of these data points before the Ling and Petrova study. That engagement that the coalition undertook provided a much better kind of numeric thought pattern behind what was otherwise somewhat anecdotal.
Okay.
We'll come back to this conversation a little bit later, Damon, when we do start to talk about some of the advocacy initiatives, and I'll bring it back up. But I think the point I want to make right now, and we've had this conversation up to this point in time. This is not a Democrat or Republican. This is an issue that whether Democrats are in control of the White House or Republicans are in control of the White House, it's an issue that keeps on coming up. And so we need to continue to arm ourselves with the research. And Ling Petrova, we're in the process of updating data, a research report by EY. We need to have all this information available to us so that we can educate the legislators on the true benefits of how their constituents use the 1031 exchange.
And like you said, Tony, I mean, I think historically, when people have looked at it from a legislative perspective, 1031 has garnered widespread bipartisan support, but it's a aspect of the tax code that I think is largely misunderstood or not, people just aren't aware of, even in the halls of Congress. I mean, is that a fair statement?
It's yes. And you listen, we can point to just the last election when we had roughly 9 new senators and 89 House members. And frankly, when we were out visiting with many of those new congressional members, they didn't even know what 1031 was. And so we're starting from ground zero. And you got to imagine that happens every 2 years, basically. So we got some fresh blood coming into Congress on a regular basis, and it really is important for us to have real supported research and data to be able to help inform them as they're looking at their various options. And going back to what John was saying in regards to pay forwards, this continues to come up as a pay forward. And we can argue whether the actual number that they're applying to it as it relates to what tax benefits they're going to achieve by eliminating the tax code. But the reality is that we have to forget about whether it's a Democrat or Republican issue. And we got to continue to stay vigilant, working with our coalition partners, making sure the congressional members, old and new, are fully aware of how this tax code is used. And it's interesting also because, and I'm jumping around and I don't mean to jump ahead of you here, Damon, because you said not to do this. But I think
you're not the first person to ignore me. My wife does it every day.
Yeah. So
go for it, Tony.
I think one of the interesting things that if you sort of peel back some of the data and there's a lot of great information in the Ling Petrova study that we can't get into here, but between 10 and 20% of the commercial real estate transactions were a result of a 1031 exchange. So let's just use that range, for example. If we just look at Real Capital Analytics in 2019, what they reported is commercial real estate transactions, $560 billion. So we're talking roughly $56 to $112 billion in exchanges. Again, rough numbers. But if you look at, according to the IPX 1031 exchange data, and they're a leading 1031 accommodator in our space, and they played an important role in providing some real live data for Ling Petrova on this latest study, the average exchange is fairly low. And what that suggests is that it's small, individual investors, not large institutional investors, that are utilizing this.
Tony, you're jumping way ahead.
I know.
let me put a pin on this point, and then we'll move on, and we'll get right back to this topic, I think. But just personally, I can tell you that, in another lifetime, I was a congressional aide, and I certainly knew nothing about 1031, never heard of it until I came into the securities world. And I know an awful lot of folks who work in the halls of Congress. And again, it's the legislative staff that really pulls the levers. And they largely don't know all these rather arcane aspects of the tax code and lots of the other millions of pages of laws we have on the books. So we'll get back to that point a bit later, but I do want to move on a little bit. We've talked about, the background and what 1031s do, what they are, but give us a little aspect, a little insight into what is the impact? I mean, how large, what kind of numbers are we talking here? What kind of volume of exchanges? How much money are we talking about? Types of assets that are being moved, which I think we've covered. I mean, obviously like kind real estate, but who are the people doing this? Are these super wealthy folks who are, utilizing this?
People.
Lewis,
Everybody.
take over. Tell us.
Everybody, all kinds of regular folks, but mostly your neighbor next door. Not so many billionaires, not many corporations, only 5% of real estate's owned by corporations. Most people are regular folks who are using 1031 to improve their lot in life, to buy a property that is more profitable for them. Somebody's buying a property from them that's more profitable to the other person. It creates value. Each property can reach its highest and best use, but mostly we're talking about regular folks. We're not talking about billionaires.
$500,000 is the average like kind exchange.
That's the value of the property being exchanged.
$500,000.
Correct. And it's usually a 30% or so upgrade. People always buy up. And so that's where the boot comes in that Keith was talking about, but that's where the advantage happens. This is not as you said, this is not some big corporate bonanza thing. This is something that can be done by the average real estate investor who's moving really a $500,000 property.
And again, thanks to the IRS and Treasury for giving us safe harbors and qualified intermediaries for safe exchanges at modest cost. Anybody with an investment or business property can structure an exchange without much aggravation or cost.
Keith, what is your typical client investor in the 1031 exchange programs that Inland sponsors? What do those investors look like, on average?
It's pretty consistent with the data that Lewis and John threw out there. The middle ground is usually around $500,000. I mean, there's a broad kind of bookend, on the lower side of that and on the considerably higher side of that as well. But oftentimes it tends to be individual investors, either through their trust or their LLC. Again, I think the takeaway is, there's perhaps a misperception that this is large, multi-million, type dollar transactions, and that's oftentimes more the exception than the rule. So, but I wanted to get back to one of your preliminary question, Damon, the size and scale, kind of the magnitude of what Section 1031 brings to the table. So, in our securitized world, we've been running over the past couple of years on average, raising roughly $3.5 billion in equity as an industry. So if you apply, 50% leverage to that, let's call that $6 to $7 billion in transaction volume. There's not a pure data source for this, but by most accounts, and we've had a lot of dialogue with the qualified intermediary industry, attempting to capture how big of the 1031 universe is the securitized market. And by and large, the common response is that, give or take, it's around 10% of the overall universe. So, if you kind of do the math and you kind of spread that across the billions of dollars in transaction volume that occur as a result of Section 1031 exchanges, that in effect is largely the concern for the real estate market as a whole, and a lot of what we're talking about. The common concern is that if Section 1031 were repealed or in some instance minimized the capabilities of it, it could create a lock-in effect. Property owners that would have otherwise been sellers may sit on their assets longer, may not sell, may not transact. And if that were to occur, the spillover effect, which has broad implications across the rest of the economy, could actually have a detrimental impact on GDP. And I hate to keep going there, but that was a big part of also what that Linan Petrova study illustrated. You think about the taxable revenue that occurs when a real estate transaction takes place, when a buyer and a seller come together. A data point that was thrown out there in the study was that 30 jobs are created as a result of a real estate transaction. And that's anywhere from, the attorneys that are facilitating that transaction, title companies, surveyors, the laborers that oftentimes are hired to improve a property after it's purchased. There's local transfer taxes that are paid. So if you take 1031 out of the equation, and if you carry my initial thought to its logical conclusion, if that has this lock-in effect and it dramatically reduces transaction volume, there's a lot of taxable revenue that now is no longer on the table. And again, I think the importance of some of these studies that were created, particularly Linan and Petrova, was to kind of capture that in a numeric-based fashion.
Well, I definitely want, let's broaden the discussion to the grander economy and the impact that 1031s provide. Because as you mentioned, Keith, the securitized industry, which again, we're most focused on, but again, it's a tiny segment really of the 1031 exchange aspect of our economy. Isn't that right? I mean, Louis, I think you have some insight on that. I mean, non-securitized 1031s that, CPAs may utilize, real estate agents, et cetera, far larger amount than 3 to 6 billion.
Most exchanges are regular folks. They've sold a duplex and exchanged into another rental property. The securitized is a small part of the number of exchanges.
Yeah, but
Tony,
Dave,
go ahead, John, or I'm sorry, Tony.
Yeah, so it may be a small, and some people may say an insignificant portion of the total exchange, but we've been working on our data and research committee has been working on gathering some data specifically related to our industry. And just throw out a couple numbers. From 2011 to 2020, total purchase price of syndicated transactions is $27 billion. That's not an insignificant number. That's roughly 1,900 or almost 2,000 commercial real estate investments. And that equated about 643 different syndicated offerings. So, although we talk about it as a small percentage of the total exchange marketplace, it's not an insignificant portion of it. So our industry plays an important role, and it also serves a very important constituent, investor. And so I don't want to lose sight of it.
Well, I think that's a great point, Tony. But I think what I'm trying to suggest is that really any change to 1031 would have not only a significant impact on the securitized world, but the much
larger
larger world of real estate exchanges in general. I mean, doesn't the
Absolutely.
Linan Petrova study, I think, quantify what the total volume of 1031 is?
So there's a second study we use for that data. Linan Petrova really does the effect of real estate, the 1031s as applied to real estate. To apply 1031s to the overall economy, there's a second study, Ernst & Young, an E&Y study, and it's being updated. Both Tony and I are involved on that study as well. The earlier one, which was done in 2015, showed that net of tax revenue, if you got rid of 1031s, you would cost the US economy $12 billion per year on average, straight hit to the GDP, net of the tax income. So it is a lose, lose, lose if you get rid of it. And it also depends on where you live, because California, and Damon, you're out there with those folks, and California is about 40% of the operation with 1031s, and then so it's a deep blue state. And you've got New York on the other, and the state of Washington, Oregon, also Colorado. Those blue states really form, I guess, the almost a majority of the transactions or the volume
with the money escaping.
Yep.
To the southeast, Texas and Florida.
Yeah, wasn't it California that tried to rein that in at some point?
They have a clawback. They have reined it in to an extent, and it's worse than that because we have an enormous budget deficit that's growing. We have politicians that want programs, some very good programs, and they see this big shiny thing, 1031, but it's based on a phenomenal flaw because the Joint Committee on Taxation, when they run the numbers, they're static. And so they say, okay, no more exchanges, every sale is taxable. And what's the tax? And that's the number they're using. But if there were no 1031, how many people would hold their property forever for the lock-in effect, or at least refinance it a few times, or hold it for decades? And so that revenue is not there. It's a tiny fraction of that revenue. And then as John says, we lose what, 20 billion a year in our economy?
So I think what I'm hearing then is that I think you all agree that 1031 impacts the economy in a positive fashion.
Yes.
It wouldn't simply be capturing taxes that are deferred under 1031s. You would be hurting the general economy that benefits from all this transaction activity, all the real estate activity, the sales and the purchases. And John, I think you said it was a 12 billion net loss to the GDP. Was that correct?
17 billion.
17 billion.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what period you look at. Yeah, but
Right.
it's a big number.
Okay.
You could
So-
create a real estate recession like we haven't seen since the 86 Tax Act and the passive loss rule.
Okay.
That's what
Well,
we're talking
why
about.
don't we move into really the point of the webinar then is, so we've got Vice President Biden, who, if you believe the polls, is almost certainly going to become the 46th president of the United States. I think most pundits are expecting the Senate to be taken over by the Democrats to achieve at least a slim majority there. And the House, of course, I don't think anyone expects is going to do anything but become perhaps more blue. So assuming complete control of the levers of federal power under the Democrats, Vice President Biden has proposed what exactly? Tony, can you want to take that one?
So his proposal is eliminating certain real estate industry tax provisions. So but he is on record for stating publicly that he would eliminate the ability to defer capital gains. So although if you go to his website and you look at his tax policy, it doesn't specifically state that, but he has been on record on several occasions stating that he would eliminate the ability to defer capital gains.
And I believe members of his campaign have specifically cited 1031s as a loophole that they would seek to close. So, I mean, it's quite clear that his proposal would impact directly 1031s. But what are some of the finer details? I mean, they're not calling for an outright elimination of 1031. What exactly are they asking for?
They're eliminating 1031 for income over 400,000. Nobody knows what that means. The whole plan is about 18 words. To be paid for by rolling back unproductive and unequal tax breaks for real estate investors with incomes over 400,000 and taking steps to increase compliance for high income earners. Does the 400,000 include the gain being deferred, or is that taxable income? Don't know. This is not legislation. This is a plan.
So let's assume, and that 400,000 annual income, 400,000 per person, is utilized a lot as a baseline for Vice President Biden and a lot of his economic proposals. And he's sworn up and down that any tax changes, whether that's 1031 or any other tax provision, would not impact anyone who makes less than $400,000 per year. So let's assume, for purposes of our discussion, that we're talking about an individual investor in one of your programs or any other program, or just a straight 1031 exchange. Their income falls beneath 400,000. How would this alteration, this cap on Section 1031, how would that impact the 1031 exchange industry, and particularly to Keith and to Lewis, to your companies?
If it includes, go ahead,
Lewis.
Keith.
Tony, you go first.
I was going to say, I don't think anybody really knows. I don't think we have an answer. It's too vague, as Lewis indicated. So we don't have enough information and substance to be able to really answer that question clearly.
Keith,
Yeah, I would add, it's interesting. We were forced to kind of think about this years back. The Obama administration suggested a $1 million cap per year per taxpayer on the deferral of gains under Section 1031. And we kind of took some time to analyze what impact that would have on the business. Depending on how you interpret the $400,000 threshold, There are probably some similarities in that analysis, but it's very difficult. Not a lot of great data to anchor on. I guess from a high level perspective, I would say it will have a fairly devastating impact on our industry. If you were still able to interact with your smaller transaction, more mom and pop related investors, the industry may still be in a position to go on. But I'd project industry sales dropping by 50% or greater simply by virtue of that effect. So there's a lot of dialogue, obviously, a lot of rhetoric, a lot of speculation surrounding this, and we've sort of been trained over the years to think about the world through a multitude of lenses. But the way I'm kind of evaluating this from a sponsor perspective is, assume that everything's on the table, assume that it's an outright repeal, and that's why it's so critical for us to kind of update the data, update our studies, update our messaging, and band together to kind of highlight what I believe to be the right facts, the data, the numbers are on our side. If you take John's GDP loss and taxation to its logical conclusion, there's a lot of lack of awareness there. So it's incumbent on all of us as industry professionals to continue to get our messaging out there and to educate on that.
Real quick, John, the GDP number you cited, what study did that come from again?
It came from Ernst & Young, their earlier study. It was from 12 to 20. I think 20 was the top end, as Tony said. I'm a natural conservative, so I'm going to give you the bottom end because 12 billion was the net loss. Now that was done a number of years ago. We should have the new one out. I think it's due out by the end of this month from Ernst & Young. They're updating it, and they're looking at just 1031's effect on the U.S. economy and the GDP. But I got to say one thing, and I think this is to build on what Keith said. I've been in a room with folks that to the left of Abby Hoffman, and still when they see the numbers and they see what good this does, all of these other threshold amounts just sort of go out the door. $400,000 is really just it is not an effective measurement to do any of this stuff. It just is not.
I think your dogs are in agreement with you as well.
Yeah.
But the FedEx guy just came. Maybe he's delivering something good. I don't know.
Well, so let's keep moving on this. I think we have the natural flow going on here. Let's get to what I'll call a threat assessment to 1031s. As you've all, or several of you at least, have mentioned during the dialogue, calls to eliminate or adjust Section 1031 are nothing new. Like you said earlier, under the Trump administration, there was a significant adjustment to 1031s. How real is the quote unquote threat from the Biden proposal, as vague as it may be? What are your personal takes on this? I mean, is there a significant threat to 1031s that we should take very seriously? Is it just another political talking point during a highly charged and emotional campaign? What are your thoughts on this? Tony, why don't we start with you?
I think we need to really take it as a serious threat. You just can't assume that it's a political talking point. We've seen an erosion of it in the last Tax Act, as Lewis mentioned earlier. It is something that continues to come up administration after administration. And, although we continue as a coalition, continue to put forth a good argument around the benefits of it, we can't lose sight of the fact that, and as John had mentioned earlier, and especially considering where we are in our economy and sort of what the next administration, whether it's Trump or Biden, face, there's going to be some significant hurdles that they're going to need to look deep and figure out ways to be able to pay for some of these programs. And so, we shouldn't take it lightly. And that's one of the reasons why we can't afford, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but we can't afford to just focus on this as an issue at the time of every election. This has to be a consistent advocacy initiative working hand in hand with our coalition to make sure that we are educating the congressional members on the underlying benefits of this important tax code.
And again, just to frame the debate or the discussion, I'm assuming that, again, the White House, the Senate, and the House will all be controlled by the Democratic Party. So I think, would you agree that if the Senate were to remain under Republican control, this is probably a moot discussion? Lewis, do you have anything to add?
Yes, moot,
Right.
moot discussion. But this time feels so different. I've never felt so divided. We can't have Thanksgiving because of COVID, but if we did, I couldn't talk to my brother and sister because of the politics. That this feels like an element of class warfare and hate for a real estate owning president. And then there's something that is a very, very tricky little point. Money is escaping the Northeast, the West, the very expensive parts of our country, escaping to the Southeast where we live, Texas and Florida. There's an enormous flow of money out of those places. And if I were in one of those places, I might want to stop it. If 1031 is allowing the money to flow, another reason to stop it is just to lock the money in.
Yeah, Lewis, I would respectfully disagree, but if the Senate remains Republican, the House
We're okay.
stays Democrat, I think it's still a threat.
Do you really?
Yeah, I do. And I'm not one to yell fire in a crowded movie theater. I just think that there's a lot of challenges ahead of the next administration and next Congress that everything is going to be looked at real closely. And the fact of the matter is that this has been a point of topic for let's call it the potentially the Biden administration, and it's not going to go away.
That's
I
your
would agree.
advocacy in education, right? That's why we need to always lobby and Hill Days and education and so on.
Yeah, Tony, I'm with you there. I mean, I think, we're obviously, we're forced to think about the outcome of the election through a multitude of scenarios, and having balance in Congress would certainly help the dialogue that we're having, and perhaps help our ultimate conclusion that maybe it's a little less tenuous in a situation where the Senate remained red. But I mean, I've been in this industry almost 20 years. We've been looking over our shoulder, around this dialogue and this debate, and it's growing in vigor. I think that, when we undertook comprehensive tax reform, and John, Tony, Lewis, we all kind of came together on that front. I think we viewed that as the, kind of being in for the fight of our lives. And things kind of settled into a fashion that I think many of us concluded, okay, it's going to be a while before we have to really sharpen our pencil and re-undertake this narrative. But what's become abundantly clear is it's an ongoing education, it's an ongoing advocacy process, which, obviously ADISA and IPA have been leaders in. And I think I wouldn't let my guard down if the chips fell in the scenario that you framed, Damon.
John, I think you had something you wanted to add.
Well, yeah, I will agree that if it's a split, if the White House is blue, the House is blue, and the Senate is red, I think it becomes more of a timing issue, because obviously the Republicans are going to have to sign off on anything, but you're going to have hearings in which 1031s are vetted. So we need to be out front of the narrative on that. And I don't know that the man in the street, this is not a big message for him. This is really a step removed. But so in that regard, cooler minds can prevail. And this is actually what has been happening. These times we have one, we go in, we have the academic studies. These academic studies are pure. We pay for the study no matter what their results. This isn't your old industry study where if it doesn't turn out right, they throw it in the trash. No, this is going to be published, whether it comes out in our favor or not. These studies are coming out and showing the advantage to the economy, no matter what, of 1031. So I think it would take somebody who's almost foolish to look at it. And I don't know that the ambient emotion, and that's what you're talking about, Lewis, the ambient emotion of the room, which is charged by politics, tends to get diminished and in some ways neutralized when you get in the back room and you're dealing with a bunch of accountants and you're dealing with legislative staff, and you're just saying, here are the numbers. Here's what happens if you cut this. this is the cost it's going to have. And it's going to have a big cost in California. It's going to have a big cost in New York and these other places. And it's going to also have a cost in Texas. The places where it's not going to be as big a cost aren't really political powerhouse places.
Well, I think that's a good segue. Then why don't we talk a bit about, again, sticking with our hypothesis that the White House will and the Senate will come under Democratic control. What would the process be if they were to pursue changes to 1031? What has to happen? What kind of timelines are we talking about? What is the process? What is the legislative process that would begin? And again, what would that time frame look like?
Goal is to undo the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, but there's always nibbling around the edges. And the tax codes are intertwined, the sections are intertwined, the regulations, it's frightfully complicated. And it doesn't happen overnight. Even if you want it to, Tax Cuts and Jobs Act took what, a year? The 86 Act took fairly, the passive loss rule was fast, but it took a while. This is not something that's going to happen in January. Maybe it's something January of 2022, but not 2021. It's a very big task to redo the tax code. It has a lot of ramifications. You have to run numbers and rerun numbers and whose ox is gored. And one of our challenges is we're very small as an industry. If our ox is gored, not too many people scream compared to the income tax rates or the capital gain rates or the step up in basis that affect all people.
Well, I think Tony and John, this is probably a good point for you guys to talk in, because again, you're the leaders of large advocacy groups that are part of an even larger coalition that looks to protect and educate in regards to 1031. So let's say it's November 4th, Joe Biden has won election, the Senate has turned blue. What do you guys and your allies on the coalition and the advocacy front start to do, and what does this process look like in your eyes? John, why don't we start with you?
Well, it looks like a prolonged and severe attack that we mount to really educate, because education has been the key motive here. It would first be on full briefings before different congressional committees, and you used to be on the Hill. You know how these work. It starts with Ways and Means, because that's going to be the most important thing. And if you can imagine, if the Senate turns blue, who's going to be the chair of the Senate Budget Committee? It's going to be our friend Bernie Sanders. So you're looking at a situation, because right now he's ranking. So if you're looking at a situation where it's all hands on deck to really explain the situation, to get us out of this ethos of class warfare, because this is one of the few issues that cuts across class warfare. As Lewis pointed out at the beginning, this is a little guy thing as well as this is everybody thing. And so I don't know that we don't have a problem with our product. We would have a problem with our marketing and teaching people about our product. We start with full briefings on the Hill, the usual, then we go to target MOCs. So then we start targeting who is particularly important. And then after that, it becomes grassroots. And Tony and IPA and ADISTA coordinate as well as with the coalition. Yeah, to do that. And even though we're small in terms of our segment, you're talking about, as Tony said before, 10% of commercial real estate. I mean, that's a big damn number. We're not talking about small taters here. So somebody's going to pay attention, but there's going to be there's PACs out there involved. I know IPA has a PAC. We're part of 1031pac.org. So there's different PACs out there that will help get us in front of the right people. And then we trot people in, not you, Damon, but we will trot in Keith and Lewis and folks like that, and work together. And I'm hopeful, because I've seen it happen before. We've all seen it happen before. But I beg you to believe that the mania that's on the street about class warfare and all doesn't travel well into the corridors of real money and how this works for the budget of the United States And people see, yeah, this looks like a cheap sugar high we can grab, but it's going to ruin our health. It starts to fade. It's not as bright and shiny as it was.
Tony, the IPA is very active in the legislative advocacy arena, both independently and as part of larger coalitions. What does the coalition, I think John hinted at it, but what does the coalition for 1031s look like? Who are your allies from an organizational perspective? And what can individual people do to, one, stay on top of this issue and become participants? I mean, as a part of the democratic process.
Yeah, so I would remiss if I started going down a list of who's part of the real estate coalition, but it's led by the Real Estate Roundtable. You have large firms like NAR, National Association of Realtor. You have REIT and a variety of other industry trade groups that have direct and indirect impacts as a result of commercial real estate. This particular coalition is clearly led by Real Estate Roundtable, the initial EY study, although the Linan Petrova study was led by the Real Estate Roundtable. The FEA is taking the lead on the updated EY study. And I think going back to what you're saying, this is really a coalition effort. We are an important IPA and ADISA are an important element of that coalition. And we represent a very impactful constituent. All the syndicators, all the financial professionals that represent the investors that go into these particular transactions play a key role and are impacted greatly. Ultimately, the end investor gets impacted. But the coalition efforts that have started already in regards to updating both of the research reports is absolutely critical and will be used in a very impactful way as we move forward. But this is really a broader coalition initiative. And one of the things that we'll be working closely with John and I with the broader coalition is how to message that out. The timing of that messaging, who we're going to be reaching out to, identifying the right congressional leaders that we need to meet with, to get behind this particular issue, to make sure that as they start moving through the process of legislating and determining how they're going to apply certain proposed tax cuts, that the individuals that are in the room making those decisions clearly have the right information, are well informed and educated, so that our voice and our industry in this code section is properly represented. So it's expanding our congressional contacts and relationships is absolutely critical. And we can do that ourselves, and we do that often on a regular basis, but we do work with a broader coalition to make that happen as well.
We have had a few questions come in on similar topics that I wanted to address before we wrapped up. Largely has to do, and it's a very theoretical question, there may not be a good answer, but I'm going to have Louis start because it is a legislative/legal question. Assuming some legislation comes along and is passed into law that would adjust 1031, how would it impact folks who are already engaged in a 1031?
Sure.
Would it be retroactive? What do you see there typically, and what do you expect?
Typically, there's a transition rule. For real estate exchanges entered after January 1, 2022, 1031 is repealed. So there'd be typically a period of time for transition. Another version is a binding contract exception for anyone under binding contract on such and such a day. Typically, there's enough time to plan your affairs. Sometimes it's a long period of time. My recollection on the passive loss rule is it came and hit us overnight. Went into committee and it came out essentially retroactive. So there's precedent for it. And the passive loss rule essentially killed real estate for what, 5 years or so after 86?
But typically we do see laws put into place that have such an impact that would give timeframes out in advance, finish up here. And people who are sitting in a 1031 exchange now, I think logically we could assume would not necessarily be impacted by a subsequent change to that law. Is that fair to say?
The odds are you'd have time to plan your affairs for pending transactions and maybe even speed up a few.
There would be ex post facto court challenges too that would slow it down, I would think, Louis. I would, usually.
Tough one if the legislation's passed.
Yeah.
And I mean, the Constitution actually has a provision that says the Congress may not pass a law that impacts people retroactively. whether or not that would be something you could litigate is another question, of course. Well, we're right at an hour, guys. I think this has been a very educational and insightful discussion. Real quick, some people have asked for more information regarding the Linan Petrova study, which we've cited multiple times, as well as the Ernst & Young study. So I think, John, you had referenced that the original 2015 Linan Petrova study is available on the ADISA website. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And I believe Tony as well.
And I believe on Tony's on the IPA website as well, and also the Ernst & Young original study. If we don't have it up, we'll get it up. But that one also had other than real estate in it at that time, so it's probably not as valid. I know Tony has a webinar that has the data on it, the Linan Petrova presentation. I think that's available, right, Tony, on the webinar. We have a little booklet, shameless plug here, that's free for anybody online. I think, Keith, you helped put this together, so appreciations to you. But there's resources out there, and we're going to be going out with grassroots information as we get closer in. So stay tuned.
So ADISA.org, real quick, Louis, ADISA.org is a great resource. IPA.com, that's Tony's website. The Institute for Portfolio Alternatives has a lot of information as well. The DIWire.com, of course, is a news site that tracks this closely. You should all be subscribed to the DIWire.com and get your daily news source. Louis, you had something you wanted to add?
One last PS I forgot to mention. The Biden proposal is pre-COVID, and the world has really changed in the last 9 months, seriously changed, and would likely cause rational people to think about economic dislocation at a time when our economy is already super dislocated.
Okay. I think that's a good point, and we could have a whole other discussion surrounding that, and perhaps we will in the near future. But again, thank you so much. Folks, we will have a recorded version of this. If you'd like a link to it, please email me at damon@thediwire.com, and we can provide that. We'll probably put it up on our news website as well. Again, thank you, John. Thank you, Tony, Louis, and Keith. Again, I think this is an exceptional webinar, and I think, again, I certainly learned a lot. I hope all of our viewers did as well. So thank you again.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Damon.
everyone.
Thank
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Keep the faith.